Welcome back to Religion at Work. Over the last few episodes, we've gone deep into American history, looking at how what we think of as work is a category that's been constructed over time by race, religion, and gender. We've also seen that there's a deep story in the United States that people should work. So what about those who can't? What about the people who aren't able to work? Or the people who work, but who don't yield the success or the stability that the deep story promises them? Today we're going to talk about welfare, which is a polarizing topic in the United States. It's something that's stigmatized for a lot of people, in part because news media and politicians tend to talk about welfare as the opposite of work. If people aren't working, if they aren't independent and self-supporting, the deep story tells us that they're at fault somehow. Remember the boy from the New England Primer who decided to be lazy and ended up in hell? He made a bad choice and suffered the consequences. That's how a lot of Americans view welfare recipients, and it shows in our programs and policies. In this episode, we'll look at how Americans stigmatize welfare recipients as irresponsible and lazy. And then we'll look at another deep story that's involved, a story about sex. What does work have to do with sex, you ask? Everything. Here's how welfare works in the United States. A person qualifies for welfare if their income from work doesn't cover their basic needs. This doesn't necessarily mean they're not working at all. They may be working several jobs that just don't add up to enough money to make rent or to buy food for their kids. In these cases, the government provides some really modest financial support through programs like supplemental nutrition assistance or temporary aid to needy families. You may have received a COVID stimulus check during the pandemic, money from the government. That's also a kind of welfare. One way to think about it is that welfare payments are a transfer of money that's not in exchange for labor, like a wage or a salary would be. Instead, these payments are based on the idea that it's good for people to have food and shelter, and that as a society we should help each other when income doesn't cover our basic needs. These payments are calculated using a lot of fancy math to determine exactly how much government support a person needs to survive. But when Americans talk about welfare, we're really debating who deserves money when they're not working in the ways our society finds valuable. Even when you have a lot of statistics and graphs involved to justify welfare policies mathematically, this isn't a rational question you can answer with math. It's highly subjective and emotional. How we individually and as a society answer that question depends on how we feel about work and money and unemployment. To get beneath the surface, let's take a look at how Americans felt about welfare in the 20th century. Polling data since the 1930s show that even though Americans think the US government spends too much money on welfare, they have consistently supported the idea that the government should offer support to those in need. But defining who counts as in need is a much more complicated question. Between 1976 and 1994, Americans were more likely to believe that welfare recipients could get along without it if they tried, than they were to believe that welfare recipients were truly in need. In 1995, 60% of Americans reported believing that a lack of effort causes poverty, up from 37% in 1982. In other words, Americans have tended to think that if most individuals just worked harder, they wouldn't need welfare and the government could stop spending so much in this area. That idea became the basis for efforts to reform the welfare system in the second half of the 20th century. As president, Richard Nixon famously called for less welfare and more workfare. He told Americans that it was the responsibility of each individual to do everything possible to support themselves instead of relying on their communities or the government to support them. That's the Protestant work ethic we've talked about before. To be a good person, you have to work hard and practice self-restraint so that you can achieve material success without any kind of dependency on others. These views of work, poverty, and American identity persisted. During his unsuccessful campaign for president in 1976, Ronald Reagan repeatedly told the story of Linda Taylor, a black woman in Chicago who collected welfare benefits using dozens of fake identities. Taylor's story gave rise to the racist stereotype of the welfare queen, a black woman who scams the system and lives in idle luxury paid for by hardworking taxpayers. Taylor was was a real person who committed real crimes, including fraud. She was also just one person among millions of welfare recipients. But Reagan and his supporters made her into a symbol for how unfair the welfare system supposedly was to people who were able to support themselves through work. By the 1990s, a lot of Americans had bought into a deep story that welfare recipients were lazy and irresponsible, and that the system itself was unfair. When Bill Clinton promised to end welfare as we know it during his presidential campaign, he won support from both Republicans and Democrats. In 1996, with the support of congressional Republicans, he signed into law the Personal Responsibility and Work Opportunity Reconciliation Act, which, among other things, required welfare recipients to show evidence that they were looking for a new job or training to learn new skills. The big talking point of the legislation was the idea that welfare should be an extremely temporary support because people should be working. Sound familiar? At the Mill signing, Clinton described welfare recipients as exiles from the world of work, which gives structure, meaning, and dignity to most of our lives. This is a new version of an old argument. In order to be civilized, to be fully human and American, people should work in ways that fulfill the white Protestant ideal. But take a look at the title of this bill, the Personal Responsibility and Work Opportunity Reconciliation Act. It's not just about making welfare recipients work. It's also about encouraging them, or forcing them, to make frugal, efficient, responsible decisions in order to achieve independence and material success. With that goal in mind, the government restricts how welfare recipients can spend their money. For instance, since 1977, the SNAP program, commonly known as food stamps, has prohibited recipients from purchasing cooked food with their benefits. So you can't buy a rotisserie chicken with food stamps. You can only buy a raw chicken and cook it yourself. These kinds of restrictions are intended to make sure welfare benefits aren't wasted by spending slightly more money for the sake of convenience. And that says something about how the government views welfare recipients. They can't be trusted to make smart decisions with their money, so the government curtails their financial autonomy. That alone is really dehumanizing. But in the United States, personal responsibility extends way beyond how someone manages their money. As part of the 1996 Welfare Reform Bill, Congress approved $50 million a year for abstinence-only sex education. What does that have to do with welfare, you ask? Here's what President Clinton had to say. To prevent welfare dependency, teenagers must get the message that staying in school, postponing pregnancy, and preparing to work are the right things to do. Clinton was responding to a kind of panic about teen pregnancy in the US in the early 1990s that was specifically linked to welfare. Statistics showed that teen mothers were highly likely to receive welfare at some point in their lives, and policymakers argued that reducing the number of out-of-wedlock births would be a good way to control government spending on welfare. Rather than providing forms of birth control, much less access to abortion, their strategy was to ask teenagers to abstain from sex until marriage. As you might guess, this focus on abstinence was really influenced by conservative Christian groups who advocated for family values. This wasn't just an economic argument about how governments can spend less on welfare. It was a moral argument about when and with whom you should have sex, and who should bear the consequences if you make the irresponsible choice. It was an argument about what a family should look like, a married heterosexual couple and children they could financially support. That image of the family was shaped as much by white Protestant values as it was by economic assessments. White families are much more likely to match up to the conservative Christian ideal than non-white families, especially Black Americans. There are a lot of reasons for this, starting with systemic racism in the form of underfunded public schools, the wage gap, and the mass incarceration of Black men since the 1970s. All these things meant that Black single mothers were statistically more likely to receive welfare than other groups. But to white lawmakers, these non-traditional family structures were a sign of personal irresponsibility and a cause of welfare dependency, not a symptom of a larger systemic problem. Back in 1965, Assistant Secretary of Labor Dan Moynihan wrote a report about what he called the disintegration of Black families. He was alarmed by rising rates of Black children being born out of wedlock, Black fathers being absent, and single Black women being the head of the household. These trends, Moynihan argued, have led to a startling increase in welfare dependency. The Moynihan Report has received a great deal of criticism, both for its flawed methodology and for the way it assumed as its premise racist stereotypes about Black men, Black women, and Black families. At the same time, though, its ideas gained a lot of political traction in the overwhelmingly white federal government in conversations about who was deserving of welfare. It wasn't just about someone's ability to work or not. It was also about sex and marriage. To be deserving of welfare, you ought to make responsible choices about sex, marriage, and reproduction. Choices that match up with what white conservative Christians thought was moral, and choices that didn't interfere with your ability to work to support yourself and your dependents. This deep story about financial and sexual responsibility still circulates in discussions of welfare policy today. Americans still have complicated feelings about welfare, and especially about who is deserving of financial support without work. Those feelings matter. If you're someone who wants to improve or reform the system, fancy math will only take you so far. The real challenge is to persuade Americans to feel differently about people who, for whatever reason, don't experience the so-called American dream of prosperity and independence. What other stories can we tell about poverty and responsibility that account for challenges related to race, class, and gender? What would it look like to support people in need without trying to control their financial and sexual choices? What would it take for Americans to trust poor people? Thanks for watching.